Hello, my friends. I am so glad you are here with me today. Close your eyes for a moment. Imagine you are walking through a garden just as the sun begins to rise. The air is cool and the grass is wet with morning dew. Suddenly, a sweet, soft scent reaches you. It is a smell you know instantly. It is the smell of a rose. Have you ever wondered why this one flower has such a powerful hold on our hearts? Why do we give roses to say, "I love you"? Why do we see them in old paintings, on royal flags, and in the hands of poets? The rose is more than just a plant with petals and thorns. It is a storyteller. It has lived through the rise and fall of great empires. It has traveled across deep oceans on wooden ships. It has been a secret shared between lovers, and a symbol of power for kings. Think about it. For thousands of years, humans have looked at the rose and seen beauty. We have seen hope. We have even seen ourselves in its delicate petals and its sharp protective thorns. It is a flower that speaks a universal language, a language that everyone, no matter where they are from, can understand. But where did this journey begin? How did a wild, simple flower from the mountains become the most famous flower in the entire world? Today, we are going to go on a journey. We are going to travel back in time to meet the ancestors of the roses in your local flower shop. We will walk through the gardens of emperors and the quiet courtyards of monks. We will explore how the rose changed us and how we, in turn, changed the rose. So, take a deep breath. Let the scent of history fill the air. Let's begin our story, the story of the rose. To find the beginning of our story, we must go back much further than you might think. We have to go back long before there were cities, before there were books, and even before there were people. Scientists have found fossils, old imprints in stone, of roses that are 35 million years old. Imagine that. Millions of years before the first human walked the earth, wild roses were already blooming. These ancient roses were very different from the ones we see today. They were simple. They usually had only 5 petals, and they only bloomed once a year, in the early summer. You see, the rose's true home is in the northern hemisphere. Most of them started their journey in the wild mountains and colorful valleys of Central Asia. From there, they slowly spread to China, the Middle East, and eventually Europe. Think about the first humans who found these wild roses. They didn't just see a pretty flower. They saw a plant that was useful. They noticed the sharp thorns, the teeth of the rose that protected it. They tasted the rose hips, the small red fruits that grow after the flower dies. These fruits are full of vitamins, and ancient people used them for food and medicine. But as humans began to build the first civilizations, something changed. We didn't just want to find the rose in the wild. We wanted to bring it home. In ancient China, thousands of years ago, the rose moved from the forest into the gardens of the emperor. The Chinese were among the first to realize that you could cultivate roses, which means they learned how to grow them on purpose and take care of them. They loved the rose for its beauty and its scent. In the Middle East, in places like ancient Persia, which we now call Iran, the rose became a symbol of paradise. The word paradise actually comes from an old word meaning a walled garden. To the people of the desert, a garden full of roses was the most beautiful place on earth. They began to press the petals to make rose water and oils, filling their homes with the smell of the mountains. The rose was starting its long relationship with humanity. It was moving from the wild world into our hearts and our homes. It was the beginning of a friendship that would last forever. As the centuries passed, the rose traveled west. It reached the great Mediterranean civilizations of Greece and Rome. Here, the rose wasn't just a garden plant anymore. It became a superstar. In ancient Greece, people connected the rose to their gods. They believed that the rose was created by Chloris, the goddess of flowers. They said that Aphrodite, the goddess of love, gave the rose its beauty. Because of these stories, the rose became the ultimate symbol of love and desire. Poets wrote songs about it, and artists carved it into marble. But when the rose arrived in Rome, things became a bit wild. The Romans were absolutely obsessed with roses. They didn't just like them, they used them for everything. Imagine walking into a grand Roman party. You wouldn't just see a few flowers in a vase, you would walk on a carpet of rose petals, several inches deep. You would eat food flavored with rose water and drink wine that smelled like roses. The Roman Emperor Nero was famous for his rose showers. He had special pipes in his ceiling that would rain down thousands of rose petals onto his guests. Sometimes, the petals were so thick that people could hardly breathe. For the Romans, roses were a sign of luxury, having very expensive and beautiful things. If you had roses in the middle of winter, it showed you were incredibly rich, because you had to bring them by ship all the way from Egypt. The Romans also used roses for triumph. When a brave general returned from a war, his chariot was covered in roses. The streets were filled with petals. The rose was the flower of winners. However, the rose also had a secret meaning in Rome. Have you ever heard the phrase sub rosa? It is Latin for under the rose. The Romans would hang a rose from the ceiling of a room where they were having a secret meeting. It meant that everything said in that room must stay a secret. If you spoke under the rose, you were making a promise of silence. From the altars of Greece to the crazy parties of Rome, the rose had become a symbol of power, love, and secrets. But soon, the great Roman Empire would fall, and the rose would have to find a new home. After the Roman Empire fell, Europe changed. It became a quieter, more religious place. This was the Middle Ages, or the medieval era. During this time, the rose found a safe place to grow behind the high stone walls of monasteries, the homes of monks. The monks were the scientists and doctors of their time. They grew physic gardens, which were gardens full of plants used for medicine. The rose was one of their most important plants. They used rose petals to treat headaches, skin problems, and even stomach aches. They didn't care much about the rose's beauty. They cared about its power to heal. But the rose also became a very important religious symbol. In the Christian church, the red rose came to represent the blood of martyrs, and the white rose represented the purity of the Virgin Mary. If you look at the great cathedrals of Europe, like Notre Dame in Paris, you will see huge, round windows made of stained glass. These are called rose windows. They were designed to look like a blooming rose, shining with God's light. Outside the church, in the royal courts, the rose was also a symbol of chivalry and courtly love. This was the time of knights and princesses. Poets called troubadours traveled from castle to castle, singing songs about brave knights who gave roses to their ladies. The rose even became a symbol of war. Have you ever heard of the Wars of the Roses? This was a famous fight for the throne of England between two families. The House of York used a white rose as their symbol, and the House of Lancaster used a red rose. After many years of fighting, the two families joined together. They created a new symbol, the Tudor rose, which has both red and white petals. It was a sign that peace had finally come. So, in the Middle Ages, the rose was a medicine, a prayer, a poem, and a flag. It was a quiet time for the flower, but it was also a time when it became deeply woven into the history of our world. The world began to open up. In the 15th and 16th centuries, explorers like Christopher Columbus and Vasco da Gama began to sail across the oceans. They were looking for gold and spices, but they also found something else: new kinds of flowers. For a long time, the roses in Europe were very similar. They were mostly pink or white, they were very fragrant, And, most importantly, they only bloomed once a year. When the flowers died in June, you had to wait a whole year to see them again. But then, ships began to return from China and India. On these ships were China roses. My friends, these China roses changed everything. You see, the roses from the East had a special talent. They were repeat bloomers. This means they would grow flowers, fade, and then grow more flowers again and again until the first frost of winter. They also brought new colors, like true crimson red and bright yellow. This was the age of exploration for gardeners. Everyone wanted these new, exotic roses. One of the most famous rose lovers in history was Empress Josephine, the wife of the French leader Napoleon Bonaparte. She lived in a beautiful house called Malmaison. Josephine had a dream. She wanted to grow every single kind of rose in the world in her garden. She sent plant hunters to every corner of the earth. Even when France was at war with England, the British Navy allowed ships carrying roses for Josephine to pass safely. They believed that beauty was more important than war. In her garden at Malmaison, Josephine brought together roses from China, Persia, and Europe. This was the first time these different species met and mixed. Because of Josephine and the explorers, the world of roses was about to explode. Gardeners began to crossbreed the plants, taking the best parts of one rose and mixing them with another. They wanted the sweet smell of the old European roses and the long blooming power of the China roses. The stage was set for a rose revolution. As we move into the 1800s, the Victorian era, the world went through rose fever. In England and America, gardening became a massive hobby. Everyone, from the queen to the local baker, wanted the newest and best rose. This was the birth of the modern hybrid rose. In 1867, a French gardener created a rose called La France. It was the first hybrid tea rose. Why was this important? Well, hybrid teas are the roses you probably recognize today. They have long stems, one big flower on top, and beautiful, high-pointed petals. They combined the strength of the old roses with the constant blooming of the new ones. It was the perfect rose for many people. The Victorians were also very interested in the language of flowers. In those days, it was sometimes difficult to talk about your feelings, so people used flowers to send secret messages. Imagine you were a Victorian lady or gentleman. If you sent someone a red rose, it meant, "I love you deeply." But if you sent a yellow rose, it meant, "I am jealous," or "Let's just be friends." A white rose meant, "You are heavenly." And a rose without thorns meant, "Love at first sight." People would carry small books, like dictionaries, to look up the meanings of the bouquets they received. It was a way to speak without saying a word. The Victorian era was a time of great work for rose breeders. They created thousands of new varieties. They were looking for the perfect shape, the perfect color, and the most powerful scent. The rose became a symbol of the perfect home and a perfect garden. But as the 1800s came to an end, the rose was about to face a new century. A century of science, big changes, and even bigger dreams. The 20th century was a time of fast change. 2 world wars shook the world, but even in the darkest times, the rose remained a symbol of hope. One of the most famous roses in the world is the peace rose. It was developed in France just before World War II. When the war started, the gardener sent cuttings of the rose to his friends in America to keep it safe. In 1945, on the very day that Berlin fell and the war in Europe ended, the rose was officially named Peace. Each delegate at the first United Nations meeting was given a peace rose. It was a reminder of what the world was working for. As the century moved on, innovation, new ideas, changed how we grew roses. Before, Roses were seen as fussy plants that were hard to take care of. They got sick easily with black spot or mildew. Scientists and breeders, like David Austin in England, began to work on new kinds of roses. They wanted roses that looked and smelled like the old romantic roses from history, but were strong and healthy like modern plants. They created shrub roses and English roses that anyone could grow in their backyard without needing a team of professional gardeners. Mass production also changed things. Suddenly, roses could be grown in huge greenhouses in places like Kenya, Colombia, and Ecuador. They were put on airplanes and flown across the world in a single night. This made roses accessible. This means that roses were no longer just for kings or rich emperors. Now you could buy a dozen roses at a grocery store for a few dollars. You could buy a rose bush at a local shop and plant it in a small pot on your balcony. The rose had become the everyman's flower. It was everywhere, in our gardens, our supermarkets, and our homes. It was a global success story. Now that we have seen how the rose traveled through time, let's look at how it has touched our lives in other ways. The rose is not just in our gardens, it is in our art, our books, and our music. Think about the great writers. William Shakespeare famously wrote, "A rose by any other name would smell as sweet." He meant that names don't change what a thing truly is. In the beautiful story, The Little Prince, the prince falls in love with a single rose on his tiny planet. He learns that his rose is special not because it is the only rose in the universe, but because he has spent time caring for it. In art, the rose has been a favorite subject for centuries. From the delicate watercolors of Pierre-Joseph Redoute, who was Josephine's favorite artist, to the bold, modern paintings of the 20th century, artists have tried to capture the rose's spirit. The rose also has many symbolic meanings. We know it means love, but did you know it also means remembrance? In many cultures, we place roses on the graves of our loved ones to show we will never forget them. In some countries, the rose is a national symbol. It is the national flower of the United States, England, and many other nations. It represents strength and beauty joined together. We even see the rose in our everyday language. When someone is very happy, we say they are coming up roses. If something is easy, we say it is a bed of roses, though we know that even the best beds of roses have a few thorns. The rose has become a part of how we express our deepest emotions. It helps us say, "I'm sorry," "Congratulations," or "I miss you." It is a tool for the human heart. We have come a long way, haven't we? From a wild, five-petaled flower in the mountains of Asia to a global symbol of love and peace. Today, the rose is still evolving. Scientists are working to create even more amazing roses. They are looking for ways to make roses that need less water, roses that can live in very hot or very cold weather, and roses that have even stronger scents. But even with all our technology, the essence of the rose remains the same. It is still the flower that makes us stop and take a breath. It is still the flower that makes us smile when we receive it as a gift. As we look to the future, the rose reminds us of our connection to nature. In a world that is often very fast and very digital, the rose asks us to slow down. It asks us to look at the patterns of its petals and the strength of its stem. It tells us that beauty is worth waiting for, and that even the most delicate things can be strong. So the next time you see a rose, whether it is in a beautiful garden, a flower shop, or even just growing wild by the side of the road, I want you to stop. Look at it closely. Remember its 35 million years of history. Remember the Roman emperors, the medieval monks, and the explorers on their wooden ships. Think about the secret messages it has carried and the wars it has seen end. And most of all, remember that you are now part of its story too. Thank you for walking this path with me today. The story of the rose is a story of life itself, full of beauty, a few thorns, and a scent that never fades. Goodbye for now, my friends. May your day be as beautiful as a garden in full bloom.